Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to Anderson House. My name is Andrew Brown, and I'm the Historical Programs Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation for the achievement of American independence, fulfilling the aim of the Continental officers and their French counterparts who founded the Society of the Cincinnati in 1783 to perpetuate the memory and the legacy of the American Revolution. In addition to tonight's authors talk, the American Revolution Institute fulfills that aim by supporting advanced study, developing exhibitions and other historical programs and tours, advocating historic preservation, and providing resources nationwide that benefit teachers, students, and scholars alike. Since 1938, the Society of the Cincinnati has done all of this work from right here at its headquarters, Anderson House, a National Historic Landmark that was completed in 1905 as the winter residence of Lars and Isabel Anderson here in Washington, D.C. Tonight's Authors Talk, a program that is made possible in part by a generous gift from the Massachusetts Society of the Cincinnati, features Dr. Eli Merritt discussing his recent book, Disunion Among Ourselves, The Perilous Politics of the American Revolution. Far from a harmonious collaboration, the Continental Congress during the Revolutionary War was so filled with political strife that the delegates feared the conflict would end in disunion or civil war. Instead of disbanding, however, these founders managed to unite for the sake of liberty and self-preservation by forging grueling compromises that held the young nation together. Tonight, Dr. Merritt will explore the deep political divisions that almost tore the Union apart during the Revolution. Eli Merritt is a political historian at Vanderbilt University, where he researches the ethics of democracy, the interface of demagogues and democracy, and the founding principles of the United States. He earned his bachelor's degree in history and a master's degree in ethics at Yale University and his medical degree at Case Western Reserve University. For his work in history, Dr. Merritt has received numerous grants and fellowships, including the Virginia Historical Society's Mellon Research Fellowship and the North Caroliniana Society's Archie K. Davis Fellowship, as well as twice awarded grants for archival research in Madrid and Seville from the Program for Cultural Cooperation between Spain and the United States. Furthermore, he is, for his work in the fields of medicine, he was awarded the Humanism in Medicine Award and Family Systems Award from Case Western Reserve University and the Gulevich Humanistic Medicine Award from Stanford University. Now, before I turn things over to Dr. Merritt, as always, I must first cover the standard housekeeping items for our friends tuning in with us on Zoom this evening. Following tonight's lecture, there will be a question and answer session, so please feel free to submit your questions for Dr. Merritt at any point during the presentation, and we will do our best to incorporate them with our live audience questions. Should you have any technical related questions or comments, those can be submitted using the chat function, and one of our staff members will be monitoring that and will do their best to assist you. So with all of that, and without further delay, please join me in welcoming to Anderson House, Dr. Eli Merritt.
More light. Thank you, Andrew. It's a great pleasure to be here. I want to start tonight by telling you about my approach to historical research. It has a lot to do with my childhood and ultimately my discovery through adversity that fear is the #1 driver of human behavior. History is my second career. Before that, I practiced psychiatry for 20 years, as Andrew mentioned. As part of my work, I prescribed medications, but my real area of specialty was existential psychotherapy, which is a psychological treatment that is most concerned with finding meaning in life, finding emotional connection with others, and coping with fear of death. One reason I went into psychiatry was to explore my own emotions, especially fear as it relates to the death of my mother when I was 6 years old by suicide. Believe it or not, her death didn't have much impact on me until I left home to go to college at age 17. That's when I first encountered the potent forces of grief, depression, and fear that are associated with a loss of this kind. There we go, fear. As I struggled to get healthy during those years, what I found the most intractable, but also the most fascinating, was my own fear. What I feared is that I would end up like my mother. I feared genetic predetermination or psychological predetermination would doom me to her fate. My way out of the maze was to make fear a dedicated object of study. I worked hard for years to become somewhat of a mindfulness master of my own inner fear. I had a good friend in college who was an artist, and the year after graduation, I asked him for a favor. I asked him to make me a large drawing of an eye, and in the middle to inscribe the word fear in the center of the eye. He did this, and the drawing hung on my wall for years as a reminder of what I was up against and what I needed to master. To my good fortune, during my 20s, slowly but surely, I was able to get free of this existential fear relating to the death of my mother. Ever since that time, though, I have continued to believe that that fear is the #1 driver of human behavior and also the #1 driver of human history. This fear approach to human behavior is also how I went about researching and writing my book, Disunion Among Ourselves. It is about what the founders feared most in their political decision-making throughout the American Revolution. I believe that if we do get to the core content that lit up the fear centers in the minds of great leaders like Washington, Madison, and Hamilton, we will understand the founding of the United States in new and insightful ways. By understanding what they feared, we will move closer to seeing the complex truth of what actually happened in those decades of the 1770s and 1780s. What I discovered in my research, as you see in this image, is that more than anything, the founders feared disunion leading to civil wars among themselves. Historians have long taught that the greatest threat to the new American states after the Declaration of Independence was the power and might of the British Army and Navy. But that is not true. The founders themselves believed the greatest danger to the American experiment in these years was disunion and civil wars. They considered that a 3-step chain reaction would be their undoing. First, in the chain reaction, one or more states would secede from the Union. Then, with that, all the states would split apart into separate confederations. Either 2 of them, this was written about 2 of them, Northern and Southern, or 3 of them, New England, Middle, and Southern. Disunion, however, was not actually the problem. It may sound strange to us today, but if the founders could have separated and lived peacefully in 2 to 3 confederations, that is almost certainly the path they would have chosen. It was the 3rd step in the chain reaction after the formation of separate confederations that was the source of their greatest fears. If such disunion happened, there would be civil wars over finances, commerce, and above all, over land. The reason the founders united into one government is that they believed there was no other bloodless alternative. With no centralized mediating government to arbitrate their conflicts, they would be left with only the sword and the musket to decide. In the introduction to the book, I call this explanatory model the survivalist interpretation. That is, the founders did what they did. They adopted the Declaration of Independence. They ratified our first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and critically compromised on some things and did not compromise on other things for the singular purpose of shielding themselves from civil wars. It all boiled down to self-preservation. My favorite way to look at the founding of the United States is as a shotgun wedding. The founders united, not voluntarily, but because they had the guns of civil war and disunion pointing at their backs. They did what they did to save their souls from civil wars. That's the one big idea I hope readers will take away from the book, and it's the one big idea I hope you will take away from this presentation. Disunion, they knew, was a sure path to national suicide. Now I'd like to ask you to think about a puzzle, the greatest and certainly the most tragic puzzle of all American history. And that is, why did the founders perpetuate slavery in spite of the unthinkable hypocrisy and horror of it. Why did these Enlightenment thinkers do this awful thing? These brilliant men who celebrated liberty and equality more than any other values on earth. They committed one of the greatest crimes against humanity ever committed. Why? Why they perpetuated slavery is the most profound question we will discuss today. But first, let's look at what this survivalist interpretation means for us today as we look back on the founding years. Does this interpretation cast the founders in a new positive light or in a new negative light? To me, first and foremost, the survivalist interpretation reveals new truth about the founding period, and that is what matters most in a democracy, seeking truth for truth's sake. Recently, I was contacted by the director of a historical organization in Massachusetts who had just started reading the book. I was just meeting him and we'd been on the phone for less than a minute when he said, "Your book scares the hell out of me." He went on to explain the reason, saying that he now fears that disunion and civil war might be written into American DNA. In a way, he's right that the book contains ominous content. The founders feared breaking apart and killing one another in civil wars. In light of the idealized view that we hold of them, that is not an easy pill to swallow. But this history also fills me with awe, wonder, and amazement. They did it. The founders held the United States together and won the war, not only in spite of the extraordinary tactical advantages of the British Army and Navy, but also in spite of the overwhelming centrifugal force of disunion that was acting on them every day. They won the war, they formed a nation, they united under, as we mentioned, our first constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and in the Treaty of Paris that ended the war in 1783, they negotiated successfully to obtain the entire Trans-Appalachian West, stretching from the mountains to the Mississippi River. Well-known historian Edmund Morgan has called that peace treaty the greatest diplomatic victory the United States has ever achieved. In most regards, this new history doubly transforms the founders into heroes. They are heroic once for winning the War of Independence and twice for remaining united despite tremendous odds. However, they were only heroic when it comes to the preservation of their own race and their own liberties and freedoms. There was an unfathomable cost to the union that the founders forged against the odds. It was the perpetuation of slavery, which we will discuss as the last and most important item we cover today. Let's next look at the specific fears of civil war of 4 delegates who served in the Continental Congress. What kind of civil wars did they foresee? Who would fight whom? And when and why? This dapper gentleman is John Witherspoon. At the time he served in Congress, he was considered to be one of the most brilliant men in America. He was president of the college later named Princeton, and he was the colony's foremost scholar of the Scottish Enlightenment. Let me read to you from a speech Witherspoon delivered in Congress in response to assertions by many delegates that the 13 states should only very loosely associate as allies during the war, not as permanent members of a durable and lasting constitutional union. Witherspoon called this idea of foregoing a tight confederation of all 13 states madness. In a speech in 1776, that's the term he used, madness. He warned with all the vehemence he could muster that the 13 states must unite into one perpetual government, because if they did not, the War of Independence was going to be, quote, only a prelude to a contest of a more dreadful nature, and indeed much more properly a civil war than the one in which we are engaged today. Why, Witherspoon asked in his speech, should the citizens of the American states expend their mutual treasure and blood in the 1770s seeking to obtain independence from the British, quote, with a certainty, as soon as peace was settled with them, of a more lasting war, a more unnatural, more bloody, and more hopeless war among the colonies themselves. Civil war among the states, that is what Witherspoon feared, and he was certain it was going to happen if the original 13 did not permanently unite into one strong central government where they could peacefully settle their differences. Witherspoon said all this, but he did not specify what would cause the great civil war he was describing or who the belligerents would be. Another prominent American delegate, Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania, gave a much more concrete answer to the question, what would the Civil War of the future look like? Galloway was also an erudite, highly intelligent political leader. He was a veteran of colonial and ministerial politics from well before the Stamp Act. He served as the Speaker of the House of Representatives in Pennsylvania for 8 years, and he was a close friend and frequent correspondent with Benjamin Franklin. In a widely distributed pamphlet that he published in the first year of the war, 1775, Galloway warned Americans that they should never even launch into independence, because if they did, the loss of the supreme arbitration powers of Britain would bring forth two subcategories of civil war. One would be land wars between individual colonies, and the other at some point would be a bloody conflagration between North and South. Like so many other observers of the American scene in these years, Galloway considered the British Empire to be a vital protector of the vulnerable agricultural southern colonies. Shorn of the mediating control of the king and parliament, he said that there would come a time after independence when the maritime northern colonies would invade the southern ones. Here's what Galloway wrote. Once the states became independent, quote, the northern colonies, inured to military discipline and hardship, will in all probability be the first to enter the list of military controversy, and like the northern Saxons and Danes, they will carry devastation and havoc over the southern, who, weak for want of discipline, it's a little bit circular writing back in the 18th century, the southern colonies, who, weak for want of discipline and having a dangerous enemy within their own bowels, must, after suffering all the horrors of a civil war, yield to the superior force and submit to the will of the conquerors. Is this what Galloway envisioned, a civil war between North and South, where the South would lose due to a dangerous enemy within their own bowels? That is, enslaved Black Americans rising up and joining the Northern effort to gain their own liberty and freedom? Once again, he did not fully specify, but I believe, based on my knowledge of this history, I believe the emancipation of enslaved people is something that Galloway and others imagined might happen when and if a major civil war broke out in America. Here we have John Dickinson, another delegate who feared that independence would lead to disunion and civil war, but in a somewhat different configuration. Like Galloway, he warned his fellow delegates against declaring independence because he viewed liberty and freedom from the British Parliament to be a violent Pandora's box. Dickinson disagreed, brilliant Dickinson, by the way, disagreed with independence so much that he refused to sign the Declaration of Independence. What he envisioned specifically is that after a successful war of independence, New England would secede from the Union and then make war on New York State in order to gain control of the Hudson River. Looking into what he called the Doomsday Book of America, Dickinson conjectured that New England would break off from the American Union within 20 or 30 years after independence. It would then invade New York, and that would be the start of a massive civil war, he said, that was too dreadful to contemplate. Now, we have to ask ourselves, why was there so much fear of New England? One reason is that New Englanders were famously united and tough. Another is that they were critically a seafaring people They were sailors, captains, shipbuilders, rope makers, and cod fishermen. That meant that they, with much greater skill and efficiency than the other states, could build up a formidable navy, which is, of course, the linchpin of imperial power in the 18th century. The Hudson River again. Hudson is a glorious commercial artery that is located solely within the state of New York. It's approximately 50 miles from the border of the New England states or colonies like Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Vermont. And it was very frequently discussed as a flashpoint where civil war would start. Another American leader who observed the danger surrounding the Hudson River was Charles Thompson, a Pennsylvanian who served as secretary of the Continental Congress throughout the entire war. As the official scribe for everything that was said and done in Congress, no one understood the political dynamics of America better than Thompson. In a series of letters to his wife, whose name was Hannah, Thompson acknowledged towards the end of the war that he thought it highly improbable that the American Union would long survive. When I look forward, he wrote to Hannah, I see a dark cloud and gloomy prospects for America. Instead of one union, Thompson predicted there would be calamities leading to the formation of 3 or 4 separate American confederations. We have here the Hudson River again. One of the confederations that would form, he forecast, was composed of the New England states, but there was always the problem of the Hudson. Like Dickinson, Thompson felt confident that New Englanders would not rest until they had gained control of this vital waterway. That meant that New York was either going to have to join the New England Confederation willingly, or there would be war. For the purpose of securing the Hudson River, Thompson said, quote, New York will be compelled to join this confederacy either voluntarily or by force. So that's one of the confederations that he thought would form. New England joined to New York. Thompson also predicted civil wars in the Trans-Appalachian West because a middle confederacy of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland would form. It would form for self-defense and for the purpose of expanding westward across the mountains into the lands above the Ohio River that stretch up towards the Great Lakes. But there was a problem here as well. In the Trans-Appalachian West, the Middle Confederation was going to encounter fierce resistance to its westward expansion by the next nation Thompson said would rise up, and that is the Confederation of Virginia all by itself. This massive and most wealthy colony in America claimed almost all the territory across the mountains, beginning with its Kentucky territory, moving northward from there all the way to Canada. And when these claims were encroached upon by the Middle Confederation, there would be war. Thompson also envisioned that the nation state of Virginia might be a monarchy. Quote, the haughtiness of Virginia, its great extent, and its boundless claims will induce it to set up for itself. And if ever royal government is set up in North America, here it will first erect its throne. The Secretary of Congress felt confident about the formation of these 3 confederations, again, quickly. New York and New England joined, Middle Confederacy, and Virginia by itself. But he openly admitted he had no idea what was going to become of the other 3 southern states, those south of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. The wild card, he said, was South Carolina. Thompson observed that South Carolina was unique in the 13 colonies for its hot-headedness and irascibility, so much so that the state would have to be humbled by civil war before its people would agree to join any confederation. Here's what he wrote, quote, for such is the fiery pride of South Carolina, such the dissipation of her morals, and her insolence occasioned by a multitude of slaves, that she will not cordially join in any union till she is taught wisdom by sore suffering. We've discussed at least some of the scenarios of civil war that haunted American political leaders in the event that the 13 colonies, later states, broke apart. Now let's look at the impact of these fears on three critical political decisions they made. First, why the Congress elected George Washington as commander-in-chief. Second, how and why the Declaration of Independence happened in July of 1776. And third, why the founders perpetuated slavery. Regarding George Washington's elevation to commander-in-chief, there are in fact three reasons he was elected. One of them relates to the prevention of civil wars. First, as we all know, the Congress chose Washington for his courage on the battlefield, owing to his service in the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763. Washington had a reputation as a fierce military leader. He was known for saying things like this about his own battlefield experience. Quote, "The right wing where I stood was exposed to and received all the enemy's fire. I heard bullets whistle, and believe me, there's something charming in the sound." Washington was also an awesome physical presence. He stood at 6'2" with an erect back, and he had an aura of invincibility. The two other reasons Congress elected Washington have everything to do with his prominent leadership and military command of Virginia. Virginia was the flagship of the other Southern colonies. Washington was from Virginia, and he was also from the South, and these two factors mattered enormously in the Congress's decision. The leaders of Congress wanted, as John Adams called it, a Southern general. This is because they were desperate to unite the Southern colonies to the cause of war, which then was taking place exclusively in New England. New Englanders wanted Southern help, and they wanted to demonstrate a show of unity in order to defeat the British after Lexington and Concord. That's the second reason Washington was elected after courage on the battlefield. It was to unite the Southern and Northern colonies in the war. Third, many of the Middle Colony and Southern Colony delegates feared that a New England army led by a New England commander-in-chief posed a direct risk that New England would make war on the other American states. The evidence of this fear is robust. As John Adams made clear, the election of George Washington was the product of a, quote, Southern party against a Northern and a jealousy against a New England army under the command of a New England general. In this, Adams was saying that the delegates in Congress feared the territorial imperialism of New England. We have to remember that the founders lived in an age of imperialism. It was normal and expected that nations would expand and exploit their neighbors if they could. Here again, in the selection of a commander-in-chief, the founders feared a three-step chain reaction. First, the formation of a New England army commanded by a New England general. Second, that army would win the War of Independence against England. And third, with its blood still pumping hard from victory, the New England army would impose its will by force of arms upon the other states. Another New England delegate, Ella Follett Dyer from Connecticut, 53 years old, and also a former officer in the French and Indian War, affirmed in numerous letters that the dual purpose of Washington's appointment was to unify North and South and to remove deep-seated fears in Southern leaders of the Continental Army being turned against them. As Dyer wrote to the governor of Connecticut in one of his letters, quote, "His appointment will tend to keep up the Union and more strongly cement the Southern and Northern colonies, and it will serve to remove jealousies that an army composed principally of New Englanders will become formidable to the Southern colonies." Remember that they did what they did to save their souls from civil wars. Fears of disunion and civil wars also explain why all 13 colonies signed on for a unanimous Declaration of Independence in July of 1776. Throughout all of June, in fact, many delegates from the middle colonies and then stretching way south, South Carolina. The middle colonies, South Carolina, were flatly refusing to embark upon independence. Why were they so opposed? It was because they feared both defeat at the hands of the British and the consequences of uniting in one permanent government with other colonies that were so vastly different from them in geography, social and political order, religion, economy, labor systems, and for many, moral views of slavery. Let me tell you what happened on June 8, 1776. The day before, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia had formally proposed that the 13 states declare their collective independence from the British Empire. The 8th was the first day of formal debates. According to Thomas Jefferson, delegates from the middle colonies and South Carolina drew a bright red line of disunion on the floor of Congress. Jefferson recorded, quote, that if such a declaration should now be agreed to, these delegates must now retire and possibly their colonies secede from the Union. Edward Rutledge of South Carolina was one of those delegates. He feared both Confederation and independence, specifically because he felt sure that New England intended to rule over the civil government, over the central government as a tyrant, and possibly to exercise its dominance by force of arms. In a letter to New England delegate John Jay, Rutledge argued that the New England leaders were from a lower socioeconomic strata of society, and therefore they would be dangerous to the first principle of constitutional government, the protection of private property. When Rutledge made explicit reference to the possibility that New England might exert its control over the other states by force, the South Carolinian, tough guy that he was, bragged that he himself did not fear the military and naval might of New England. Here's what he wrote to Jay, quote, the force of their arms I hold exceedingly cheap, but I confess I dread their overruling influence in council. I dread their low cunning and those leveling principles which men without character and without fortune in general possess. Let's pause on leveling principles. It's a concept some of you may know, but it's not common in common parlance today. By leveling principles, Rutledge meant principles of equality and democracy, which might just be imposed upon the other colonies without their consent. On another occasion, similarly, John Adams used the expression leveling spirit to describe the fears of many that one day the New England colonies might level the aristocratic societies of the middle colonies and the South. As Adams recorded in his diary, a New York delegate named Philip Livingston told him, quote, if England should turn us adrift, we should go instantly into civil wars among ourselves to determine which colony should govern all the rest. He, referring to Livingston, he seems to dread New England, the leveling spirit, etc. Hence we're thrown out of Goths and Vandals. Let's look now at the special dilemma that the middle colonies faced in 1776. Notice, please, that they are in the middle. The map tells the story because if New England and most of the southern colonies declared independence without the middle colonies, those in the middle would be caught in an impossible military situation. The middle colonies, as the name implies, are squeezed geographically between New England and the southern colonies, and that meant big trouble if they attempted to remain in the British Empire at the same time that the two regions flanking them declared independence, swearing to fight until the bitter end. If the middle colonies did not aid New England and the southern colonies in their war of independence, allowing free passage on roads and rivers, as well as supplying their armies, chances were that Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey, and New York would become the worst fields of blood in the expanding imperial civil war, one that would then pit the middle colonies against the New England colonies and the southern colonies. When the Congress first considered independence on June 7th and 8th, the question was simply too hot to handle. Soon after the secession threat that took place on the 8th, the delegates suspended deliberations on the resolution altogether, postponing it until July 1st, when they promised to reconvene and finally vote yes or no on independence. Monday, July 1st arrived, and what happened? The colonies voted and the outcome was disastrous. Only 9 colonies cast ballots for independence. Pennsylvania and South Carolina voted no. Delaware divided, rendering its vote null and void, and New York abstained because it lacked formal opinion from its assembly. July 1st. This was a day of extraordinary peril because by now, diehard New Englanders and Virginians, for sure, had no intention on backing down on independence. And as the vote of that day demonstrated, a supermajority of Congress, 9 colonies, were ready to move immediately to independence. So the middle colonies in South Carolina were left with a life and death decision. Were they going to let the vote of July 1st stand and go their own way? Perhaps asking to join the new United States at a later date? Or much smarter, would they request a revote and quickly get into line with the pro-independent states or colonies at that time? What would you have done if you were a middle colony delegate caught in this catch-22? Remain in the empire and fight against the New England and Southern colonies? Or would you throw in your hat with the pro-independence people? I know what I would have done, and it's exactly what a sufficient number of anti-independence delegates chose to do under extraordinary pressure. On July 1, they requested to revote the matter the next day, and overnight, under an obvious injunction of join or die, the dissenting delegates from the middle colonies in South Carolina changed their minds and lined up the votes necessary for the passage of a unanimous resolution for independence. No moment in our history better exemplifies the fact that the founding was a shotgun wedding more than this one. The Congress formally passed the resolution of independence on July 2, and 2 days later, it adopted the unanimous Declaration of Independence. Thomas McKean of Delaware, who was a delegate then, later described that early July of 1776 was a do or die moment. Quote, unanimity in the 13 states, an all-important point on so great an occasion, was thus obtained. The dissension of a single state might have produced very dangerous consequences. Here again, with the Declaration of Independence, we see that the founders did what they did to save their souls from civil wars. Let's return now to the most profound and tragic decision the founders made, the decision to perpetuate slavery despite the fact that they knew that the practice was pure despotism. They did this not only during the American Revolution, but also afterwards in the United States Constitution that was ratified in 1788. The founders did nothing about slavery at these junctures for many reasons. By one historical interpretive lens, they committed this crime because they lived in a world of white supremacy handed down to them by generations. By another interpretive lens, they perpetuated slavery because both Southerners and Northerners were inextricably tied up in an economic system that exploited both the slave trade and slavery for profit. No matter how heinous these practices were, the economic argument emphasizes, the founders simply could not break their addiction to the lucrative status quo. Both of these two explanatory models are correct. Yet, as the study of history often reveals, the story is more complex. The survivalist interpretation we've been examining today also explains why the founders perpetuated slavery. In every major decision they made in the 1770s and the 1780s, they felt the guns of disunion and civil war pointing them into the Union. And that includes the decisions they made about the slave trade and slavery. If any Northern state had demanded that the collective United States abolish the slave trade or even adopt a graduated plan for emancipation, one or more Southern states would secede from the Union, others would follow. Next, they would form a Southern Confederacy, and after that, civil wars over finances, commerce, and land would ensue. In perpetuating slavery, the founders made what I like to call a devil's bargain, meaning that they knew they could either advance a federal program for liberating Black Americans from slavery or they could secure freedom from civil wars for themselves. They chose the latter, self-preservation, with vast and tragic consequences for the future of the nation they began. All three of these interpretations, the white supremacist interpretation, the economic interpretation, and the survivalist interpretation, all of them are correct. Added together, they get us far closer to understanding why the founders perpetuated slavery than we have ever been before. Let's begin to wind down by returning to the brain and to the extraordinary influence of fear on human decision-making, whether in the life of an individual or in the life of a nation. So powerful is fear that it drove the improbable formation of one United States rather than 2 or 3 separate American nations. So powerful is fear that it overwhelmed the consciences, the compassion, the caring, and the moral sensibility of the founders to the point that they preserved slavery decade after decade after decade. It would take until the 1850s for a new generation of courageous American political leaders to finally say, no more. The expansion of slavery must end now. As we know, this principled stand against slavery in the mid-19th century led to disunion and civil war on a massive scale. Finally, I want to take just a moment to celebrate complex history and complex truth. Not simple history, not one-dimensional truth, but multi-dimensional understanding of complex phenomena, just like what we just discussed with regard to why the founders perpetuated slavery. Complex history is so important in a democracy because it's the most powerful medicine I know for maturing us as individuals and for maturing us as a society. What happens if a person only accepts a single simplistic interpretation of the causation of something as complex as why the founders formed one nation or why they perpetuated slavery? It narrows your mind. It makes you righteous and divisive, and it makes you a force for polarization, tribalism, culture wars, and history wars. On the other hand, if we challenge our brains to accept the white supremacist interpretation as correct, and also the economic interpretation and the survivalist interpretation, that is, if we take a both-and approach to learning and understanding instead of an either-or approach, if we do this, we grow emotionally and intellectually, and in doing that, we help our democracy survive and thrive. This dynamic, salutary effect of complex truth on our minds and on our democracy is one reason I love history so much. It's also why I believe that we as a nation should teach history in grades K through college with the same priority, intensity, and vigor as reading, writing, and arithmetic. Thank you very much. Andrew, we're going to take some questions. First from folks here, and then the many more folks on Zoom, yeah?
Hi there. Thank you so much for your talk. I'm curious about how this survivalist interpretation of the founders' motivations can help us understand the creation of the United States Navy. What you said about some of the people in the founding generation being afraid of New England as a maritime power. That's very interesting. And I think especially Federalist 11, where Publius makes the argument that one of the reasons we need a union is so that we can have a strong Navy. And I'm wondering, what would the survivalist interpretation of the American founding have to say about this motivation Publius lists? Is it to constrain New England and centralize power so that New England doesn't have it? Is it to compete against other empires in the region? How does this interpretation teach us something about the United States Navy? Thank you.
Good question. In some ways, I wish my colleague Ian Toll was here, who wrote a wonderful book about the formation of the first American Navy. But what I can say in response to that is, you know, I really did not do justice to James Madison today. He really appears throughout the book. And he's an individual with extraordinary, I think, temperamental sensitivity to underlying dangers. Some people will put danger and fear and out of their mind, they'll deny it, but Madison really let it in. So throughout, and I think this is a remarkable way to reframe Madison's genius, he would be sitting here nodding his head saying, this guy's completely right about this. They tried to hide it because, of course, it seemed treasonous to talk about disunion and civil war. The evidence is abundant, but it's the tip of the iceberg as to, I wish I could have participated in their conversations. But Madison, one reason why Madison wanted to give strong power to the federal government was he wanted the government to have coercive powers to actually overcome conflicts between the states. And so I can't remember at this moment what his position on the Navy was, but for sure, he and Jefferson would want the United States to have the Navy, not New England to have the Navy. So it's not an area of specialty of mine, but I'm pretty certain that that would be the position that they took. If someone were going to study the evolution of the Navy in the United States, among other interpretive lenses, I would say to use this one, understanding the deep fear of New England. Really, I mean, an awesome region, I have to say. I'm from the South, but I just thank God for New England. Thank God for New England. So, but it would be wonderful for someone, yourself or someone else, to take the survivalist interpretation to the Navy and report back to me. There's my email. I love feedback, so I put my email up there. I really welcome feedback of any time about my ideas or the book. So.
Thank you very much. This is such a provocative kind of, can you hear me?
That's on.
I'm good?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, very provocative. In terms of your experience, you went through a trauma. I think the United States sometimes at that period was going through fear of an external enemy,
yeah.
Be it the French or the indigenous people or enslaved uprisings, right? And that's a big motivation. And is there a real difference between Southerners and Northerners? Are they like two different species? The way we describe it is like they had this way and they had that way. I'm sure if the North had 10 months of summer and could get 2 or 3 crops in, they would have slavery as well. And what did the South not have that the North had?
Mm-hmm.
The North had very good waterways to be able to make big saws that could gut the wood and create the boats. The South didn't have any way of storing water to make mills. They had to send, even during the later period of slavery, where cotton was king and the economy in the United States was run with cotton, they had to send their cotton up to the North to be manufactured. That Southern defect wasn't caused by any kind of intellectual deficiency. They just didn't have the source of power back then. It predated Portland cement, hydraulic. Anyway, so as I understood it, the real conflict early on was between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists wanted to keep their local banks. They were opposed to a central bank. And they also wanted to acquire all of the land from the indigenous people as they expanded towards the Mississippi. And you can go and see these maps that have the original 13 states extending all the way.
Well, let me, if I may, I do know a bit about the Federalist period, but it's a bit out of my area of expertise. But in answer to your question about the North and the South in particular, which again, Federalists and Anti-Federalists are a dynamic force in our politics, I'm actually quite curious to better understand the great danger, and Madison even said it at the Constitutional Convention, the great danger is the split between the North and the South. So I think in some ways we formed non-Southern and Northern parties specifically because that might have led to early disunion and civil war. But your question about North and South, they frequently, privately, John Adams would say the Continental Congress is the most harmonious body on the planet I've ever seen. He wrote the Novangelus essays, as some of you may know. In private letters, he would say, this North and South, they seem like different nations, quote, different nations. So this was there from the very beginning. And the different nations have everything to do with slavery. And you're right that the weather, if Thomas Jefferson were speaking right now, I think I'll paraphrase, he would say, you know, the weather, the really great agricultural posture of the Southern colonies is why Britain did this damnable thing, which was introduce slavery into the Southern colonies. Jefferson's a complex person. He had slaves. He felt that African Americans, from the evidence we have, were inferior. But he, his whole life, was furious at the fact that British merchants and corrupt British parliamentarians had introduced slavery into the Southern colonies. I mean, on and on and on. He's every juncture of his life. So he's complicated. He lived out slavery like a lot of folks, like James Madison, but they deplored it. They just couldn't figure out what to do about it.
You know, can I add another point?
Okay.
And it has to do with who really profited from slavery. I mean, we're really, first of all, if you look at who was in charge back then, in the very beginning, it wasn't as if it was a mass democratic, everyone had a vote back then. It was a very tight group that was as small as the Electoral College is now, representatives. Many of them were members of the Society of the Cincinnati. They were generally large, well-to-do people who had extreme influence in their communities. Those are the people who were making decisions. Those are the ones who profited from this, or who profited from expanding lands and taking over vast amounts and selling that to new immigrants. You know, I mean, the rewards of the members of the Society of the Cincinnati was to be given a good partial of the Northwest territories, which they could sell to immigrants to be able to make back the money that they had.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
So we're talking about a very small, concentrated group of people who had deep economic interests in the expansion, and they could go west. They didn't have to like attack each other. It wouldn't make any sense. I mean, eventually they were slowed down by the indigenous people, and they seem to have gone north to Canada for the War of 1812. But this is the condition, and also it can't be forgotten that it was the North that really profited most from slavery. They controlled the shipping, they controlled the manufacturing of cotton into textiles, the insurance, the exports. I mean,
well, great, thank you. Let me just answer that, and then we'll see if someone else is interested. I'm not an economic historian, but I can tell you for sure that during the period I know best, the Southern colonies profited a lot more from slavery than the Northern colonies. Virginia alone, and it was tobacco then, of course, not cotton, Virginia commanded 40% of the profits of all exports from the country. So I don't know where I would put it on the pie. Back then in the 1770s, we wanted to say North and South were inextricably bound up in this economic system, true, but I would say South was 80% and the North was 20%. And the Northern states, as we know, some rapidly in the 1780s and 1790s, came up with plans for emancipation of slaves. And the Southern colonies, of course, didn't do that. It was a much more entrenched economic issue and also basically population issue. Anyone else?
Does your interpretation hold, do you think, as we look at future disunion during the War of 1812 with the Hartford Convention and later during the tariff debate in the late 1820s, 1830s?
You're asking whether or not the survivalist interpretation would also apply to the War of 1812 and the Hartford Convention, for example, that happened in 1840?
Yeah, because the disunion was, the disunion continued.
Yes.
And was it kind of that underlying fear? I think that,
well, it's interesting to see then,
but
it's interesting to see then that as many of the predictions were in the 1770s, 1780s, that it was New England that made the first motions towards secession. And what we don't know, of course, is what's brinksmanship versus what's true movement towards secession. I have to think in something like the Hartford Convention of 1814, it was a combination of both. There was very serious problems, a very serious understanding that these separate nation states are different. They are, in fact, separate nations. We should get out. We should break apart. Why did we ever form one country? And I think at the end of the day, a lot of forces were acting on them. The war ended for one, as you know, but I think that they recognized that civil war was going to come. The most important thing I think to understand about that is, I was going to say all minds, but not all minds. Most minds of people with money, a little bit like the gold rush in our nation, and then Silicon Valley rush, maybe still going on today. The Western lands were just a place of incredible opportunity and beauty and cheap land. So this idea of the original 13 colonies all wanting a piece of westward expansion is an irrepressible desire. And for reasons of justice, this goes back to 1775 when they first started discussing forming a union. And when disunionist threats were made, Thomas Jefferson said, look, if you in Congress here are going to mess with our lands, I'm not sure we're going to be able to form a union with you. In response, this is in 1775 or 1776, the Middle Colony said, you know what? If you plan to keep all that land for yourself, I don't think we're going to want to form a union with you. So what I want to point out is that westward expansion, as long as westward expansion was going on, and they were going to have conflict over who had sovereignty or profit rights over the Western lands, it was either the Congress had to solve the problem or they would have to fight. We all know that what human beings fight the most over is land. And that, I am certain, based on all the evidence I know, thank God we formed this government, and just look at the history that finally the government finally failed in the late 1850s to accomplish compromise instead of civil war. But starting in the 1770s, 80s, 90s, Missouri Compromise onward, it was legislative constitutional solutions to the problem of land, and it would have been civil war.
I want to ask a question related to sort of how you open the talk about what I think of as, or correct me if I'm describing it wrong, but this idea of personal fear as a motivator.
Yeah.
I think most of the talks seem to center on sort of fear of a particular policy outcome leading to warfare, sort of fear on a larger scale.
Yeah. Both relate to death, but go on.
Well, sure. I do wonder, though, you know, so much of our history, or at least my history as a child, was sort of revolved around this sort of American civic religion and these founders that we put on a pedestal holding these great ideals. To what extent is there profit in re-examining decisions that Washington may have made out of fear of financial ruin, or Hamilton's fear of sort of never really belonging due to his immigrant status? Have you explored that, and is that worthy of exploration?
So you're saying if I explored the founders' fears of other things,
more
sort of
I'm just saying, maybe I should distinguish. I'm distinguishing between sort of personal fear, candidly, of the sort that you were describing in your own experience, and whether there's potential reexamination of some of the key founding moments through that lens, to the extent we are able to sort of, based on the historical record, sort of get inside the head of some of these folks.
I like that. That's what would be kind of a pure psychoanalytic approach to the founders. I've not looked at that in any real detail, but in an integrative manner, it's much on my mind. Once again, James Madison is a fascinating character, and maybe in some ways because I feel like I have some things in common with him. He left college. I don't know what happened in his childhood or what his genetics were, but when he got back from Princeton, where he attended, James Madison fell into an absolutely despondent, depressive identity crisis. And so in an indirect answer to your question, it is utterly fascinating to think about the personality structures of the various founders and which of them went into this great American experiment. Some saying, forget it, everything will work out. Let's, as John Witherspoon was up against, so many delegates said, let's just be allies for this war. Let's not form anything that looks like a confederation. Witherspoon, obviously something in his personality like James Madison enabled him to say, that is madness. So I think that was his personal development that gave him what I think is the deepest insight into the dynamics of the country. And so those folks, I think, probably did much more to save us from early disunion and civil wars than some of the deniers or blowhards or happy-go-lucky folks.
First, thank you for a insightful and intriguing talk tonight. You mentioned basically there's a commonality to all of them having fear, a fear of civil war. So you've got people that are on one side, like Galloway, Dickinson, saying, "No, hold on a minute. We're afraid this is going to lead to civil war. Let's just kind of stay with where we are and maybe change things a little bit." And then you got Witherspoon on the other hand, also fearing civil war, but saying, "No, let's go forward with this. This is the solution."
Yes.
I guess I'd like to hear you talk more about, they have a common fear, but they're going in different directions, and kind of why they were led in two different paths. And what might somebody like Witherspoon say to Galloway or Dickinson about, "I share your fear, but you're looking at it wrong. You ought to look at it the way I'm looking at it."
I think you really have hit the nail on the head with that. I actually feel like, from what I know, although the folks often didn't commit, I cover that in the book, that they often would use code language to talk about disunion and risk of civil wars because they didn't want it to be perceived as treasonous. And that says nothing about all of the remarkable primary sources that were burned by families. This happened, we know. They were embarrassed. They wanted to just keep the traditional heroic narrative of the American Revolution going. But I think that process that you described is active, and that those that felt confident we can solve this, and maybe those that were more committed to liberty and freedom, like John Adams, another incredible individual, he was aware of these dangers, but he had the sense that we can do this. He had the sense, I didn't cover much of John Adams today, talking about his incredible fears of North and South, these separate nations wouldn't be able to survive. He said, the only way we'll possibly be able to do this is with, and now I'll paraphrase, with the highest and most prudent degree of statesmanship government has ever seen. Adams once wrote a letter that said, the chief virtue, the first virtue of a politician, he actually used that language, the first virtue of a politician is patience, the second is patience, and the third is patience. That gives us a little insight into John Adams, who again, I think, did foresee and understand these things, but he felt like we can do it. Whereas Galloway, who later became a loyalist, some of you may know that, was scared to death, and he said, "I'm getting the hell out of here." And that's what he did. He left the country. He was so afraid of what was going to happen, I think, in this two-pronged fear of defeat by the British. And if that didn't take us down, oh my gosh, we're not going to be able to form a central government successfully because we're all too hot-headed, and we're going to just live out what he described there, endless land civil wars. And isn't it just amazing, this prediction of North-South civil war? I mean, lots of predictions of civil war, but that one, I continue to be awed by this research years and years after I've read it 4 or 5 times. So I think you're onto something there. Some folks had confidence in knowing what the dangers were, and others just said, too dangerous, let's not do it. John Dickinson, to his credit, said, no, do not enter independence. I will not sign the Declaration of Independence. But he stayed in, and he is really a remarkable founder who continued to serve the country for the next decade. Other questions?
Well, you've done a good job at clearing my list over here on Zoom.
All right,
So
let's see.
thank you. But we do have one very common denominator in terms of a question here. And I think this is where we'll wrap it up. Looking at the U.S. today, would the founders be surprised at the divisions, or would they see their worst fears justified, given their reasoning really hasn't changed?
Well, I think 2 things. I think the founders would look forward for, I mean, for sure, there is just no question. And they would see the Civil War happen and they would not be surprised at all. I mean, even James Madison on his deathbed in the 1830s, he was worried that this was going to be the outcome. It was always there. It was always there. They were always fighting against it. So I think the fulfillment of their greatest fear was the Civil War. Frankly, I think they would look at us here today and they would be somewhat disappointed, but they would think this is a little bit more politics as usual. What's so different between the first 86 years of our history, the politics are really different. I think we shouldn't forget that, because the politics of state sovereignty and the politics of disunion were so real then. The state said, you watch out, we're going to leave this union. That was a serious threat, and it was going to lead to that three-step events of one state secedes and the others are like, we're staying with this, or we're going with that, and we get the civil wars. Today, we have people like Marjorie Taylor Greene hyperbolically and demagogically declaring we should get a national divorce. So there's a little danger there, but I don't perceive right now we have any real threat of secession. I'll tell you, maybe a good way to conclude. My only fear of secession in this country over the next 50 to 60 years, maybe less, takes us back to John Locke, who said, when arbitrary government is installed, the people have a duty to the right of revolution. And when he says that, revolution in that case doesn't mean pull out your guns. It just means if you get an arbitrary government, arbitrary, despotic government, unconstitutional government, first you try diplomacy, we try and bring Europeans in, Macron would be over here trying to help us get the arbitrary government out. But if that failed, what would happen? Some part of the country would have to secede and say, we are not going to participate anymore in an arbitrary government. That's what the American Revolution was, 100% that same thing. So I'm not hoping we get to this, but I do believe in John Locke. And so sometimes states, or sometimes 13 colonies, secede from unions for very good reasons. Thank you.
All right. Well, Dr. Merritt, thank you very much for coming, and thank you all for attending. Thank you all on Zoom, and we will see you in a few weeks. Get home safe, everybody.